So hello everybody, and welcome back to the final session of today. Not the final session of the conference, we've got tomorrow as well, but the final session of today at the European 5G conference. I hope that everybody's had a bit of time to go and grab a tea or coffee, and it's great to have you all back here with us for this final session. So we have a really interesting session ahead of us. Tomorrow's sessions at the conference are going to be moving on to focus specifically on a lot of the spectrum issues, spectrum management issues. And in a kind of a way to build into that, we're going to start now with a focus on connectivity and looking at some of the issues around that. So specifically, we're going to be focusing now on the Connectivity Toolbox and some of the measures that are being put in place to try and smooth the rollout of 5G networks and lower costs and things to 5G networks as well. So to introduce things in a lot more detail than I can, I'm now going to welcome to the stage our moderator for the session, Amit Nagpal from Ether Consulting. Amit, welcome, great to have you with us. Before I pass over to you, one other thing I actually wanted to do was just to mention again that we have the polls running. So I'll let you introduce what those polls are, but we do have 2 audience polls running again. So please do use that. Please do vote on those and give us your thoughts. And you can do that again using the tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Having said that, Amit, over to you. Looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. And as you said, so far we've had a sort of very good conference. You know, yesterday we started talking about sort of 5G policy and a lot of discussion actually about money and you know, the finance to make that happen, both from sort of the European funds, but then also potentially from the investment bank and also obviously private industry's contribution. And then today we've been talking about you know, some topics sort of all to do with making 5G happen, you know, making sure that everything is secure, and also looking forward, making sure things are become increasingly sustainable. And exactly as you said, Dan, we're going to follow that session on with another sort of implementation aspect of 5G. And really what we're going to be talking about here is how we can make 5G and sort of the fiber that's needed to support 5G roll out faster. And one of the ways we can do that is through the creation and implementation of what's called the European Connectivity Toolbox. So this session is going to explore the toolbox, we'll start with an introduction of what it is, talk about its implementation, and then talk about what it means. And to do that, as usual, we have a panel of experts. In this particular case, we have 5 panel members, and as usual, each panel member is going to get an opportunity to make some introductory remarks for 5 to 7 minutes, something like that. And then we'll have an open discussion, and I look forward to bringing in any questions that are posted up to the extent that's possible. I see there's been a lot of questions posted up in previous sessions, so I'll do my best to get as many of those in as possible. So I'll introduce the panel members in turn as they speak. But before we go to our first panel member, just a reminder, as Dan also mentioned, we have 2 poll questions, one on the most important aspects of the Connectivity Toolbox, and a second question about the potential for fixed wireless access to help reducing the digital divide and meeting sort of gigabit targets that Europe has set itself. So it'd be great again to get your votes on those, so please do vote. I appreciate if anybody's not familiar with the toolbox, you may want to hear 1 or 2 of the first presentations before voting, so then you can decide which you think is the most important aspect. But otherwise, please do vote as soon as you can. It'd be great to get your answers on these. Okay, anyway, that's my introduction. Let's move over to the speakers. So first of all, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Carlotta Reyners-Fontana, who is the head of the European Electronic Communications Policy Unit in the DG Connect in the European Commission, and she's going to start by giving us all an overview of the toolbox. So it's a very good introductory presentation for anyone not familiar with this already. Over to you, Carlotta.
Thank you, Amit, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the EU 5G conference one more year, and this time to speak to you, indeed, to present to you the European Commission recommendation on a connectivity toolbox. I'll see how much I influence the poll questions. I hope people get to understand what we have proposed and we are trying. So if we move to the next slide very quickly, I would first like to let me start a bit with setting the political context that preceded the adoption of this recommendation, because it's important to then understand the proposal. So let's go back almost a year ago when we started with this pandemic and the very, very strict confinement rules. And we all know that we all realized that connectivity was critical for continuing working from home, for continuing schooling, and therefore for businesses, but also for each of us for entertaining and even for staying connected with others. And very quickly, this was also moved to the political leaders who realized that digital connectivity is key for Europe's recovery and for allowing advanced digitization of the economy and the society as a whole, to enable actually innovative services, but also to support the twin transition, which is also very important, the green transition. And therefore, already in June, the Telecoms Council called on the Commission and the Member States to take measures in this regard, and actually to improve the investment conditions by ensuring a timely award of 5G spectrum and by taking measures to accelerate the deployment of fiber more generally. But a bit later, in September 2020, when the European Commission newly president made her first State of the Union, she also was very clear, highlighting that it was unacceptable, the situation regarding what we call the digital divide. And she mentioned the Next Generation EU as an opportunity actually to use them also to focus investments into secure connectivity. Next slide, please. So with this background, we looked into what were the measures in where we had to focus and take action very urgently. And these two came across, on the one hand, how to continue taking down barriers that hinder the deployment of new networks. And on the other hand, how to enhance further 5G spectrum coordination. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about it in the conference already. So moving to the next slide, I will present you what is the recommendation proposing in the area of cost reduction. We focus in 5 areas, and I'll briefly take you through them. Permit granting on the one hand. This is often highlighted as too cumbersome, far too cumbersome and complex and very long for network operators. Now, in view of the expected densification of 5G networks due to the 5G deployment, streamlining such administrative processes will be very important. So what the recommendation does is that it calls on member states to come up with best practices regarding the means to achieve that, how we can ensure reasonable deadlines, and also a more simplified process overall. And a bit, as you know, we have already used this when we provided the permit exempt model for the small cells. And I'm sure that most of you are aware that the Commission adopted last year an implementing act defining such small cells that are subject to a permit-free deployment. And that this is already a measure in place that will greatly facilitate the deployment of 5G. When looking into transparency, the fact is that access to complete and comprehensive information about where physical infrastructure is and civil works, it's critical. It takes time and it costs money if you don't have access to that information. And therefore, the recommendation there calls for improving the quality and quantity of such information, as well as for enhancing the role of the so-called single information point, which is already provided in all member states doing that measure. Access to physical infrastructure. Access is also important, in particular when controlled by public bodies, can also significantly facilitate the deployment of 5G. Think of rooftops on top of public buildings, to give you an example. And this, again, it is important because of the densification. So the recommendation calls again member states to think of measures to enlarge such access rights. On a more procedural aspect, you see their dispute resolution. Well, an efficient and effective dispute resolution is crucial for solving those disputes which are actually in the middle, which stand in the way of an efficient deployment. And therefore, member states are also encouraged to look into that. And last but not least, electronic communication networks can and should make all efforts to reduce the environmental impact, their environmental impact. And while reflecting overall on measures to promote network investments, we are calling on member states to develop best practices, how we can incentivize that the networks that are deployed in the future are greener. And I guess this resonates a bit with previous session in this conference on sustainability. Next slide, we will move quickly to 5G spectrum. I'm going pretty quickly, I think. So there we focus on 3 areas. The first area is the timely assignment of 5G pioneer bands. So this is critical. You know that member states, that there was a deadline for assigning these bands. It was end of last year for the 26 GHz, for the 3.6. It was mid last year for 700. But obviously the pandemic also made things more complicated. But however, we still call on member states to reduce as much as possible the delays, to think of measures to facilitate that, and to make use of the peer review that was proposed in the European Electronic Communications Code, and that can help them preparing better these assignments. A very important second area is, as we know, auctions are taking place as we speak. The conditions that are attached to the spectrum assignment, they can have a great impact on investment incentives. Therefore, the recommendation is calling on member states to think of innovative ways to search for financial incentives of spectrum authorization procedures. And such innovative models can help in the deployment of 5G. They should also think, for example, how can we be more flexible when authorizing millimeter wave spectrum bands like the 26? This topic has quite of a prominent place in the toolbox, and best practices that come out could also apply beyond the 5G bands in the future. Last but not least, very important, we see merit thinking ahead of the future in a coherent approach to spectrum authorization in order to promote seamless wireless connectivity, in particular for cross-border industrial uses. Those industrial use cases that will rely on 5G, such as connected and automated driving, for example. So member states should try to think and develop measures to ensure the most coherent authorization practice in this new area, starting by the identification of use cases as such. And the next slide. Very quickly, because I would also not want to overstep on what Søren will be explaining, what's a bit the process that guidelines give you a bit of a timing, because this is a recommendation that actually requires or expects follow-up by the member states, who are called to come up with their proposed best practices. And in order to facilitate or to frame the process, we have provided for some quite tight deadlines, which you can see there, and that Søren will report. So we are now closely soon to get to the moment of the adoption of the toolbox by the end of March. And with this, I have finalized my presentation. Thank you.
Let's move on to our second speaker. So that's Søren Nubel, and he's going to talk to us about the implementation of the toolbox, or at least the first stages of the implementation of the process in terms of working with the member states to define what is in the toolbox. And he can do this as in his role as co-chair of the Connectivity Special Group. And he also sort of has a sort of member state hat, if you like, as he's the Councillor for Transport and Infrastructure for the Germany's permanent representation to the EU. So over to you, Stefan. Søren.
No problem. Thank you very much, Amit, and good afternoon to everyone in the audience. I'm happy to be able to give a brief overview on the process for developing the so-called Union Toolbox for Connectivity, and to give you an idea where we stand with the rather ambitious endeavor of developing this toolbox. I think Carlotta has already shown the timeline, or given a glimpse on the timeline, which shows that it's rather challenging. Moving to the first slide, please. For developing of the toolbox, a so-called special group has been set up on 16th of October last year to address actually the tasks in the recommendation which Carlotta has mentioned a second ago. The members of this special group are the 27 member states, so it's a member states driven process, as well as the Commission, which is of course also there to help and to assist in the development of the toolbox. The chairs of the toolbox are three. It's me, it's a colleague from Portugal, and it's also a commission colleague. It's Carlotta, actually. And we have also created two subgroups, since there are two main topics in the toolbox, namely, firstly, the fast VHCN deployment and secondly, best practices for the investment-friendly authorization of 5G radio spectrum. So we have two subgroups who are assisting the special group and helping the special group in coming forward with the best practices. Next slide, please. Until now, on the both topical fields, member states have actually identified and shared between themselves and with the Commission information and best practices in their own member state and in other member states, but partly also on non-EU countries. So that's has happened under phase 1, which ran until the 20 December last year. At this date, also, we have published a summary report of the best practices, which puts together the information gathered from member states in a mere compilation structure, so there's no evaluation done in this phase. Now we are currently in the second phase, the creation of a common union toolbox for best practices itself. In this phase, we then evaluate the input of member states in phase 1 and also possible additional information. For this purpose, member states have been split up in 11 work teams, looking into different fields which have been coming out of the input from member states, but I should say also from BEREC and the RSPG. The idea is that these work teams draft initial proposals for the best practices for both topics, and I would like to give a quick overview over these topics in a second and show this on the next slide, please. In view of today's conference, I focused myself on the 5G radio spectrum that might be potentially included in the toolbox. So the areas are firstly the environmental aspects, so environmental sustainability. Secondly, spectrum and their financial incentives for investments. Thirdly, the question of spectrum authorizations for cross-border use cases for verticals. And thirdly, issues which are related to EMF and public health. I should say that this last point is not directly coming from the recommendation, but has been added since it has also, of course, high relevance for the deployment of 5G and the success of 5G deployment. All these points, apart from the last one, are related to the recommends of the recommendation and have a direct connection with this. For the purpose of being complete, I would like also to quickly mention the other areas we are looking in with regards to VHCN deployment. This is light permit granting and other mechanisms. It's electronic means and the single information point coordination. It's also rights of ways and fees and the functionalities of the single information point, as well as access to physical infrastructure and dispute resolution. Of course, the concrete best practices will be more detailed what I put here on the screen. I would like to highlight that we are still in the process of developing these best practices and have not finished them, so there's no final agreement of member states, but I would like to give maybe a short glimpse what could be a best practice. For instance, when it comes to financial incentives for investment by spectrum users in 5G. One best practice of among others which are discussed under this topic refers currently to the question of reserve prices. And for instance, it could be recommended to member states that reserve prices should be set by using a methodology, and this could be, of course, benchmarking for specific band under considerations, financial valuation, models and or other models in order to estimate the valuation of spectrum. In this context, it could be also mentioned that there should be no maximization of revenue for the states to be sought. So this is only one example out of many, many others, and it would completely occupy all the time that we have here if I would like to try to guide you all of the issues which are currently discussed. Other best practices in this field, just to mention them when it comes to investment, might be also the avoidance of spectrum scarcity, the payment of fees and installments, individual authorization regimes for 26 gigahertz frequency range, combining financial incentives with obligations or infrastructure sharing. That's only a short idea. Next slide, please. What are the next steps? So member states working teams have completed currently the initial evaluation and have also put them for discussion by the subgroups. So as a next working step, the proposals by the working teams are going to be sent to the special group, which is going to finalize them as best practices, and member states will be invited to agree in close cooperation with the Commission, of course, on the Union Toolbox for best practices. And I should say that it's intended that this agreement is reached in a consensus way. The toolbox is going to be published, and member states are afterwards asked to provide the COM with a roadmap for the implementation of the toolbox by 30 April 2021. This is 1 month after its adoption, and to report to the Commission on the implementation of the toolbox by 30 April 2022, so 1 year later. I should say that in this respect, the implementation of the toolbox is a voluntary issue. So the toolbox is non-legally binding upon member states. However, member states will, of course, do their utmost to implement the connectivity toolbox as far and fast as possible in view of a self-commitment which exists in this respect. And the special group will assist member states also afterwards upon request in the implementation of the toolbox, in particular regarding the usage of the recommended tools. I hope that this gives a short overview of what is going on there and gives you an idea where we stand now. With this, I would like to give back to Amit. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Soren. And I think from those first two presentations that we've had, if anybody wasn't familiar with the Connectivity Toolbox, hopefully you've got a good overview now and feel more comfortable answering the first poll question. So we're now going to have a couple of presentations which helps a little bit with the second poll question, if anybody is looking for some insight before answering that. I'm pleased to introduce our third panel member, who is Florian Damas. He's the Head of Policy and Regulatory Affairs with Nokia, and he's going to talk about how the toolbox can help us to close the digital divide.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. So Nokia is a leading global supplier of 5G technology and network solutions and products. I will start first with the change of end-user digital behavior. And these are the challenges that we are facing with the COVID-19 crisis, which is a good time to reflect on that. And we are all relying heavily on networks on our day-to-day activities. Well, not only we've seen a significant increase of traffic, but networks are faced with the following: a shift in peak activity. Daytime traffic jumped 30–40%, while evening and weekend traffic rose from 10 to 15%. The dispersal of sources of traffic as more demand was generated from individual homes rather than business and leisure hubs. An increase in the number of devices, users and households connected simultaneously and connected for a longer time. And a jump in upstream traffic as consumers became not just consumers, but also generators of data, notably through video conferencing. And the resulting impact on fixed and mobile broadband networks has varied by region, but with a consistent theme. Mobile networks have suffered moderate to significant degradation in speeds and latency due to congestion, and fixed networks were also impacted, but less severely. And these data volumes are exploding reports are only part of the picture. They mask the fact that networks are artificially capped by service levels and sometimes simply limited by the existing infrastructure. And the DSL or 4G connection delivering 10 megabit per second will never show a massive spike in usage because it cannot even support a higher speed. In addition, users have quickly learned to adapt their behavior to deal with network congestion, for example, by disabling video during teleconferencing calls. By examining the changes in usage outlined, we can clearly see the impact on broadband networks coming to terms with the new normal in digital behavior. And this, of course, has implications for network operators needing to maintain services, but also for governments needing to protect citizens, society, and the economy. The crisis has shown the importance of reliable, very high-speed connectivity, which is no longer a good to have, but is now an essential utility. And COVID-19 is likely to have accelerated the evolution of the organization of our societies. with remote working and learning becoming much more prevalent, as the European Commission outlined just now. In this context, ubiquitous, very high-capacity connectivity is the essential infrastructure which will enable EU countries to adapt the post-COVID world and address most challenges, such as economic vibrancy, in a sustainable way. So my second part is on the latest technological developments of 5G and how it is related to fiber, hence the importance of the toolbox, but also of the review of the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. So 5G is a mobile technology and is set to change the world. It is at the heart of every operator's strategy, but it will require significant investment. And to be successful, operators need to find ways to cost efficiently to deploy 5G. I will not spend time on sharing physical infrastructures and sites between mobile operators, which is, by the way, common in Europe, but more on 5G small cell transport. How do we support the performance demands, throughput and latency, and the radio access network densification that actually 5G requires? And one possible solution is to connect small cells to fixed fiber infrastructures, a sort of convergence between fixed and mobile, supported by fixed fiber technologies by using multiple wavelengths in a single fiber. And in terms of network resource, spectrum is to 5G what wavelengths are to fiber. By overlaying multiple technologies in a single fiber, it's possible to connect small cells. This use case is for mobile network operators which want to densify the radio access network through the introduction of small cells in an area where fiber to the home networks are already deployed and have sufficient spare fiber assets that can be reused for mobile transport. Another use case is for FTTH infrastructure providers to offer the 5G transport service to mobile network operators and accelerate fiber network monetization. Fiber access networks become much more attractive to 5G. New fiber technologies such as 25 gig PON symmetrical ensure that ever-increasing capacity demands of transport networks can be met on the same fiber infrastructure. Another technology is fixed wireless access. Instead of terminating a network to a premise with fiber, the last mile or segment of the network is covered with 5G technology to lower the cost of connecting end users. One use case for fixed wireless access is in rural areas, providing access to end users who still do not have any wireline internet connectivity, meaning that the telephone line cannot even provide internet access, and or have only speed internet access via their mobile devices. So these technology developments on 5G convergence with fiber will require much more coordination of civil works to effectively reduce rollout cost and speed deployments. The last part is about spectrum for 5G. And in this respect, the early communication on the 5G pioneer bands, 700 megahertz, 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz, and 26 gigahertz, in order to address the initial 5G spectrum demand in low, mid, and high bands, had been very useful, as well as the clear targets to EU member states to make these available by latest 2020. Furthermore, technical harmonization in the European Conference of Post and Telecommunications has been timely completed for all three pioneer bands. But as of December 2020, only 3 countries, Italy, Finland, and Greece, have complied with the timeframes set out in the European Electronic Communications Code in completing the task to open all these 3 pioneer bands before year end. Less than 50% have been assigned to 700 megahertz, slightly above 50% had assigned spectrum in the 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz range, and 26 gigahertz assignments rank even lower. And these delays severely impact the harmonized rollout of 5G services across the Union, where the example innovative wide area IoT and connected car applications cannot rely on union-wide coverage. The inability to roll out 5G services in mid and high band severely impacts the possibilities of innovation and introduction of new services, requiring 5G along the entire European value chain, and delays the benefits of 5G networks to European consumers. Furthermore, some auctions of spectrum for 5G withdrew undue numbers of auctions proceeds, thus reducing the funds available for network investments. GSMA has proven in a study the correlation of high auction proceeds and the slower take-up of services. Last, European policymakers' short spectrum life and narrow political focus prioritizing low consumer price over network quality have a negative impact on investment and technological development in the region. That ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian. I think you covered a whole range of issues there. So a lot of lot of food for thought on those topics. I mean, I think the next speaker is going to pick up on one of those topics, which is the sort of use of 5G for fixed wireless to help meet the sort of gigabyte society targets and close the digital divide, and go into this in a more quantitative way. So I'm very pleased to introduce Stefan Zahler, who is CEO of the consultancy Colliago, and the floor is yours, Stefan.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And yes, you're right. I'm going to follow on from some of the remarks that were already made on bridging the urban-rural digital divide. I'm going to talk about the role of 5G WA to reach the European 2025 broadband connectivity target of 100 megabits. Next slide, please. So the target, amongst others, of other targets for the gigabit society, there is this 100 megabits by 2025 of being available to every household. And in urban, it is possible that this target might be reached, but in rural Europe, as of end 2029, only 18% of households actually had that available. And a huge investment is required, 123 billion to get there, assuming 100% of the target is reached, with 50% actually connected. Next slide, please. And the reason why this is so is because connecting homes or bringing fiber to homes in rural is very expensive. Here you see two charts. This shows the cost per home passed and per home activated, depending on the household density. So you can see the lower the density, the higher the cost, and the curve is quite steep at the lower end. And this is why it's particularly challenging to bring the 100 megabits to rural households. It's also very expensive. Next slide, please. And this is where 5G FWA comes in. And of course, in order to do this, you need spectrum. You need a lot of spectrum to bring 100 megabits to everybody, let's say, in a village or small town. It's not sufficient to simply have the C-band 3.4 to 3.8. You need additional upper mid-band spectrum. And the range I'm talking about when I say upper mid-band spectrum is the range of 3.3 to 7.125 gigahertz. The more spectrum you have, the more households can be supported. So if you look here at the chart on the right side, this is a number of parameters supported per 5G FWA site. So this assumes FWA uses an existing mobile operator site. And the more spectrum you have, the more households you can support. So it goes up from 90 households supported, which is clearly not sufficient if you only have a 400 megahertz of the C-band available. And as you make additional spectrum resources available in upper mid-band, you can support up to 540 households from a single tower. Next slide, please. Now, some people might say, well, what about the range of this mid-band spectrum between 3.3 and 7 gigahertz? It's not actually the issue, because if you look at the typical distribution of population in rural areas, they're actually clustered around towns. So this shows the town of Gord, and you can see here the dimensions. Very easily, a single site can cover the whole village or town of Gord with a population of 1,800, which would equate to somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 households. Next slide, please. Here's another example. This is a population of Rosenthal, a town in Germany, in Hessen. And here I also show you where the existing cell sites are located. So there are existing masts. Some of them might already have fiber to them, others may not. But either way, you could easily install the additional upper mid-band radius on this side. So leveraging existing infrastructure to bring 5G FWA delivering 100 megabits to all the households in such villages and small towns. Next slide, please. the savings associated with this are substantial. So if you had an additional 2 gigahertz spectrum available, upper mid-band spectrum, and you delivered 100 megabits, which is, after all, the 2025 targets, the saving compared to doing it by fiber are 79%. 79%. If you have to deliver higher speeds, the savings decline because fiber then has an advantage. Clearly, if you want to deliver a gigabit, upper mid-band spectrum doesn't cut it. You would need additional millimeter wave spectrum, but this is further along. So when we're looking ahead for the next 5 to 8 years, then you could achieve these savings. Next slide, please. So if you make the calculation that roughly 53 billion out of the money that still needs to be spent to reach the European target, the 79% saving equates to a capex saving, and that's just capex, of 42 billion. 42 billion. So that is substantial, especially given the strained finances of countries in the context of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So to summarize, 5G mobile and 5G FWA, you can have one network to deliver both mobile and fixed broadband. And the clever thing about this would be most countries in Europe, I think all, they have set coverage targets or implemented coverage targets for 5G when they assign 700 megahertz spectrum or LTE with the 800 megahertz spectrum. So the coverage obligations are there. That is why all of these small towns are already covered. And so they can build on this coverage obligation because the mast is there and you can just deploy the additional spectrum. The second one is scalability. If you use fiber or want to use fiber to achieve this, you actually have to run fiber down every street to do this. This is not very scalable. Whereas in contrast, you stick a radio on a sector and you cover the town. So that makes absolute sense. You get more spectrum, you can scale it as demand increases. And lastly, there's the speed to market. Much of this can be done tomorrow. So the incentive is there, the spectrum is there for operators to bring fiber to a tower and offer 5G FWA, which is, by the way, the fastest growing broadband technology, of a 5G FWA to rural households. And who knows, rural households might even get 100 megabits earlier than many urban and suburban households. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
That's great, Stefan. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation there on the use of FWA. Okay, over to our final panel member. Can I introduce Matthew Adogu? Apologies if I slightly mispronounced the surname there. He's the Deputy Head of Group Regulatory Affairs with Orange. And Matthew, I believe you're going to talk about the sort of the spectrum aspects of the Connectivity Toolbox and spectrum's importance more generally.
Yes, thank you, Amit, and I really would like to thank for the invitation and the other previous speakers for their very clear introductive presentations. As a representative from the telecom industry, I will try to give you some elements on what we are expecting from this important work around the BP cost reduction directive and the connectivity toolbox. First of all, as a large operator, European operator, operating in 7 countries, European countries, we strongly believe in the benefit of the digital single market. And that is why we see benefits in the fast-track process arising from the work around the toolbox in order to ensure that we, the MNOs, do face the best regulatory and operational environment in all member states, especially when this can lead to important benefits in terms of rollout speeds and cost reduction. Because at the end, this turns into better services for European citizens and businesses, either by increased available speed or improved coverage. Secondly, I would like to highlight some issues regarding VHCN rollout. Deploying 5G is not anymore an issue of permit granting in most of the cases. However, there are still multiple challenges. For example, you have to put up on the rooftops the new active antennas, and that require a crane and to block the traffic for a few hours or a day. We have to face the skepticism of the population that has been growing during the pandemic on the necessity of a new generation mobile network, leading to new elected mayors asking for moratorium in the deployment. In fact, good and bad relationship with local authorities can never be tackled by a single piece of legislative work. And Orange, and I'm sure that many other operators do agree with us, we don't have any other choice but to engage in good faith discussion with those local authorities. In addition, we have developed some experience in managing the existing process in the countries where we operate, and the potential introduction of new rules under a very short notice could then have a counterproductive effect in destabilizing the rollout. That's why this should lead us to be pragmatic when trying to improve the existing rules. Thirdly, we welcome the Connectivity Toolbox, in particular regarding some game-changing proposals, such as RAN-sharing agreements, which are a great way to improve the efficiency and accelerate 5G rollout. It is also a way to reduce the overall cost of mobile networks, as well as answering to some of the societal questions that arise with the deployment of this new mobile technology. While the recommendation issued in September seems to support such agreements, we have also noticed that in the recent years, the sector has been facing a lot of support on such infrastructure mutualization, with challenges arising against a number of already signed and deployed RAN-sharing agreements. On the contrary, we in Orange estimate that due to the current level of coverage in each member state, where there is no more significant difference between the coverage of the first one and the third or fourth operator, notably because of the increased regulatory and policy pressure, it is time to turn this into a more comprehensive support for large RAN-sharing agreements, potentially covering a whole member state, as long as those agreements still allow for commercial differentiation at retail level. This is notably the case when the spectrum and the core networks are not mutualized. And lastly, I would only raise the issue of spectrum allocation. I think this is a field where the industry has been suffering from detrimental procedures with high prices or with spectrum reservation leading to artificial scarcity. The telecom industry is now effectively waiting to see the implementation of the code and the Connectivity Toolbox recommendation by member state, notably on the full allocation of harmonized spectrum to MNOs without any scarcity and low level of reserve prices. On this last point, I heard Søren previously talking about best practices on the calculation of these reserve prices. I would like to remember everyone that the European Code is already setting the standard in Article 42.2, with reserve prices are to be set at the value of those rights in their possible alternative use, and not at the level that reflects the telecom industry way to monetize it. Because in the end, you can spend €1 only once. This is one of the most important topics. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Mathieu. That was again a very good presentation covering a wide number of issues there. So I think we can move on to the open discussion. I think I'll kick off, and then we'll see what the audience would like to ask. But just to start off, maybe I could sort of ask a question to sort of probably more focused to Carlotta and Søren, but others feel free to also come in on this. And really just to understand, why sort of has this sort of toolbox format for the recommendation, come out of the sort of connectivity recommendation. Why particularly that particular format? And sort of associated with that, I mean, the timeline for kind of adopting it and implementing it seems pretty tight. I mean, I'm very conscious, for example, that we have the deadline coming up in March for the sort of identification of best practice, which looks like the work's in good flow for that. But then member states literally just have 1 month to actually come up with their own plans. And I can imagine if it was just 1 or 2 people coming up with a plan, that 1 month is fine. But I can just imagine how bureaucratic the process must be in each country to get that plan agreed as the national plan. Can that be done in a month? Is that realistic? So perhaps over to both of you. Maybe Carlotta, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you, Amit. Very good question, because indeed this recommendation sets out a new form, this toolbox form, which is meant to be like an agile method, an agile way for putting together actually all member states exchanging their best practices and proposing something. So maybe to recall, as I said at the very beginning, we know the COVID has hit it dramatically, the European economy. The telcos are not the most hit, but they will suffer, the sector will suffer from the overall economic downlook. However, the sector can and should positively contribute to the recovery. So it's very important that if measures can be taken to accelerate the deployment of networks, that they are taking. So the toolbox format, what it proposes is a softer but swifter measures that can be put in place, both in a collaborative manner, as I said, but also in a more agile and rapid way. And indeed, you're mentioning already implementation. What do we expect from this? So the implementation of the best practices should help improving the situation relative to today. So we hope that in a relatively short time, we can move the situation to better and easier network deployment and access to 5G. We heard a lot, because the alternative would be to wait until the review of the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, which we are working on, but which we know takes a lot of time. And therefore, the alternative is waiting for 3 more years. And this, we don't think maybe that this is feasible. Just a word on timing. Yes, it is challenging. Søren has said it, but I must say that at the same time, we are seeing, the commitment to the process from member states, it's very important. They have been working very hard, and the progress is being extremely good. And we are close to see already now a first draft of the processes. So, voila, we are trying to do that. A clarification on the roadmaps. What we ask within 1 month is for each member state to set out how they plan to implement the toolbox in their country, by which time, so that there is also transparency about the process. And then we come back in a year, and then we report, and we look at it together. But in 1 month, it's sort of their plan, their roadmap, their intentions.
Just maybe to add, I think Carlotta was very, very comprehensive in her answer. And I think the idea of the toolbox is indeed, as she described, to do something immediately and to see what can be done within the creation of 2 legal acts, so until the Commission is able and to present the broadband cost reduction review, and then we have the discussion with Parliament and within Council, which will also take some additional time. So it is an immediate measure to help to better the situation, but it has also, of course, therefore its limits. Now, it cannot be expected that with this kind of approach, we reinvent the wheel. So it's not possible to achieve the same outcomes as it would be possible with a legal instrument. However, I think what Carlotta said, I can only confirm member states are very, very committed to engage in the toolbox process. When I was starting the process, I was also a little bit overwhelmed by the time frame put forward by the Commission, but I can say that within the process, it had shown that the member states are very much engaging and are very much committed to contribute and to see what can be done and what also they can receive and achieve from the toolbox process to increase the situation in their respective member state.
Very, very good to hear. Would anybody else on the panel like to comment on this, perhaps an industry view at all, or shall I move to another topic?
Yes.
Yeah.
I already said we very welcome the fact that the member states and the European Commission work on the toolbox, due to the fact that for 5G deployment or VHCN deployment, rules are to be implemented now and not in a 2 or 3 years period, so that there are real benefits in the rollout. So that's something we are looking forward.
Very good. Okay, a question has come in. It's not specifically on the toolbox. It seems to be a wider question on the whole electronic communications code. So I'll read it out. It says, in 2021, I think, monitoring the impact of the European Electronic Communications Code should be at the forefront of overall activities, including assessing future technological and market developments related to end-user provisions within the scope of electronic communications and the digital ecosystem in particular. However, only 7 EU member states have notified full or partial transposition of the directive. Will not be a problem. I guess, will that not be a problem? Would anyone like to pick up on that? I mean, Carlotta, would you be able to comment on this at all?
Yes, of course, I say directed. So indeed, the person is referring to the fact that the European Electronic Communications Code was due to be transposed by 21st December last year, and that only few member states have done so. The person is also pointing to the importance actually for the timely transposition. I mean, just to recall, the code was a whole revamp of the framework, setting out new measures to first promote investments, as we are discussing now, in new networks, but also very importantly, new rights for consumers and many new also rules regarding spectrum. The Commission has taken action. We have sent letters to the member states already. I mean, we are calling on them to transpose very quickly. We understand the pandemic was a bit also complicating things, we understand, but still we have taken action because we do believe that it is of utmost important that the code is transposed as quickly as possible.
Okay. Anybody else like to comment, or should we move on?
I just like to take this of evidence between the reality of what's going on and the ambition. So in fact, it was on the 4th of February that the Commission issued infringements proceedings against 24 out of 27 member states. And they had 2 years' time just to implement a piece of legislation. Now, the target to reach the connectivity 100% of households in rural involves digging up the countryside, thousands of kilometers of trenches, which is a far bigger task. So what are the chances of this actually happening? And I think the only way this 100 megabit target can actually be delivered is through 5G FWA.
Okay, you're very pressing this case this afternoon, Stefan. Very good. Okay, before we, I'm going to explore that topic a little bit more, but before we do so, maybe we can talk a little bit more about the connectivity tool more generally. And I'd actually like to bring in the poll results here, as I have them now. So just a reminder of the question, it was, which of the following connectivity toolbox measures will accelerate fiber/5G deployment? So the first option was streamlining permit granting procedures. That got 13% of the vote. The second was improving the single information point. That got 8% of the vote. Third was expanding the right of access to public infrastructure, 33%. Fourth was improving the dispute resolution process, 0%. And we then had ensuring timely access to new spectrum bands, 38%. And then we had coherent spectrum authorization conditions, for example, to support verticals, 8%. And then other none of the above, 3%. So sort of the clearest two were ensuring timely access to spectrum bands, which I think we'll come on to later in the discussion. We'll have a further discussion about that. But also the second one was expanding rights of access to public infrastructure. So essentially government infrastructure, making the government, regional, local level, national level infrastructure, making that more available. And that I found that actually quite interesting because, if anything, looking at some of the things like improving the single information point, I can imagine that is going to be very difficult to do because there's so many levels of hierarchy in government. Getting all that into one information point and having sort of a one-stop shop, if you like, for submitting permit applications and monitoring them could be quite difficult to implement, given the huge number of IT systems that must be involved in a country, for example, just to try and do anything like that. But the interesting one about, you know, the big percentage going for the right of access to public infrastructure, that might be a lot easier to do, in fact. So I'm very interested to see that. But yeah, I'd be very interested in any panel members' thoughts on this as well. Was there anything you found surprising there, and any comments on this?
I'd say this is a clear reflection of how 5G networks actually work. Oops, the pictures seem to be gone. Are we still up?
I can still hear you, Steph.
Yeah, okay. Because if you think about it, it's all about capacity in dense urban environments to deliver the IMT 2020 requirement of 100 megabits in the downlink and 50 megabits in the uplink. That is a challenge. And how can you cater for this traffic density? It's spectrum times sites broadly. That's what it is. So, and that is why these two answers are there: spectrum on the one hand and sites on the other. And by the way, when we're talking about sites and public infrastructure, it's not so much rooftops, but it's lampposts and such like, because this is the density that will be required for 5G in 5 to 10 years' time.
Good. Anybody else like to comment on this?
Yeah, so I mentioned the densification of cells that we're going to have to deal with 5G, and that is as important in rural areas as well as urban areas. And if we come back to, you know, how we could streamline permit granting procedures, for example, we could think about, you know, some possible improvements when it comes to permit granting procedure extended to mobile radio stations, for example, or to cells over public infrastructures on rooftops, as Orange mentioned. And also probably looking at more harmonizations when it comes to light, you know, a lighter licensing regime for antenna sites. So just a few examples there that I'm giving.
Very good.
Maybe if I may add, Amit, I would say actually I was not that surprised. I mean, indeed, I mentioned at the beginning that access to, because of the densification of, you're saying, access to more sites and more places, it's really critical, coupled with the spectrum part. I would also consider that a bit of permit simplification would certainly help. And what you were mentioning, Stefan, I mean, we did already that with the small cells. We already did that by making available new physical infrastructure, the street furniture for small cells only, and by having a no permit mechanism. So a bit taking inspiration of that, we've used a bit that in some of the ideas that are put in the recommendation.
Great. Okay, well, let's talk about, oh, sorry, Soren, did you want to say something there?
I just wanted to bring into the discussion also the few, I think the topics mentioned seem to be the one which are most common for most member states now. However, I think what is also important to consider when you think about the toolbox, so I mean, many of the measures which are in the toolbox are implemented already in certain member states. So at the end, the question, what is the best practical and best beneficial best practice from the toolbox depends also, of course, on the situation in which a certain member state is. So member states where access has already been granted, maybe the additional access to spectrum is not a problem and might be something else. So it's more the question, what is the situation in a member state? What is the best and the most effective best practice in this regard?
I guess you raise a very more general point. You always have to take poll questions and answers with a little bit of a pinch of salt because of the context they're raised in, and the people sort of answer them in slightly different ways. I mean, I suppose thinking about this first question, I mean, possibly if we'd asked this question at a sort of conference on FTTH rather than 5G, we might have got a slightly different mix of answers, of course. So, absolutely. Okay, well, let's start talking about sort of some of the wireless side and the spectrum side. Maybe it's worth starting again with the polls here. So the question we asked was, do you believe that 5G fixed wireless access could make a material contribution to reaching the initial part of the EU's 2025 target, specifically making 100 megabits per second broadband available to 100% of households? And it was an overwhelming vote for yes, 73%. and then no 27%. So real strong feeling that FWA could make a difference here. And I must confess to the audience, when we were composing this question, we did specifically sort of look at the wording and did focus very much on this initial target of 100 megabits per second, because as Stefan raises the point in his presentation, the economics are very different when you're talking about 100 megabits per second versus 1 gigabit per second. And in fact, that plus, you mentioned, I think, initially 123 billion in your presentation, Stefan. That immediately sort of brought me back to where we started on Monday, with Pierce's mention of something like 130 billion available for sort of communications, connectivity out of the new funds that have been found. And the one thought I had was, it's kind of what fixed wireless does is that, exactly as you said, it sort of plugs the gap in the short term. And, you know, wireless solutions have been used in the short term to meet broadband targets. But as you say, you know, the speeds on the wireline networks go ever faster. The content on websites, 4K TVs come along, 8K TVs will come along, all that kind of thing. So that there's almost a sort of growth rate of data demand of fixed traffic is kind of growing faster than sort of wireless is necessarily growing. So is this kind of, you know, as I think your analysis very well demonstrates, this is kind of a good solution for the immediate problem, but it isn't a long-term solution. And the thing that struck me was that sort of implies that sometime we do need to put in the long-term solution. You know, we can't keep saying manana, manana, manana. We do actually. And I wondered, just as you were talking, I sort of thought back to Pierce's presentation. There's 130 billion of money, by the sounds of it, looking for a home within connectivity. You know, is this a chance to actually do the long term? You know, this may never happen again. You know, so much money is made available for this aspect of the economy. You know, is this the chance to actually fix the problem once and for all? And maybe, like you say, maybe, you know, you can't fiber up everybody in 5 years. It's impossible. So maybe it's a combination. Maybe it's a bit of FWA to keep us going, but actually the bulk of the money goes on the long-term solution of putting fiber to all these people. Because as I say, this big block of public money for this type of project may never happen again. So I don't know what you think of that, Stefan, and other panel members.
Yes, it's certainly true that if you aim at a gigabit, then doing it with wireless, unless you have millimeter wave, which is even more challenging, may not be sustainable. But I think the question is this: you asked somebody in a village, what would you like, 100 megabits today or 1 gigabit in 10 years' time? And I think if we phrase it in that way, I think the answer is clear. And I don't think this will ever be stranded investment, because even in 10 years' time, not everybody in a village want 1 gigabit. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive or stranded investment. Let's not forget, it's a single infrastructure for fixed and mobile. So there will be also great mobile services in places like Gord or Rosenthal in Germany.
Great. Yeah. Anybody else like to comment?
I think what's interesting is that some member states have started to have targets, different targets for fixed and wireless networks, and one does not replace the other. So I think it's an opportunity also for investors to differentiate, for operators to also to differentiate based on their offers, and also to align with actually what I mentioned earlier, the digital and user behavior, which is changing pretty fast and much faster than actually what could drive actually in a way maybe sometime investment or policies when we look at the gigabit society targets. So there's a correlation based on what, let's say, the crisis we are facing today.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions on. Oh, sorry, Carlotta, go ahead. Sorry, you're on mute. Sorry.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to come out, if you allow a bit, because on this long term, I mean, you made the point, and of course, from our point of view, would like to stress that point. I mean, our targets are ambitious, are gigabit ambitious. So in the end, in fact, the target is that networks can be upgradable to gigabit, meaning without significant capex or time. And why that? Maybe just to recall, I mean, this connectivity is not only for households, of course, critical, and we don't want to leave anyone one behind, but it's also for all those new things. So it's also about how it will be used for industrial applications, agricultural, etc. So I think it's important we keep the ambition. I mean, that's very important because there will be needs, and we're thinking some years ahead. At the same time, of course, one has to recognize that the fixed WA is able to provide already more than 100 megabits, and that brings indeed a lot of improvements in terms of connectivity in certain areas. But I mean, this gap between technologies as they evolved has always happened, and I think we have to be careful about it. But I just want to pass the message that it's important we keep the ambition also. It's very important.
Very good. Okay. So I've got 3 questions on spectrum. So what I'm going to do is raise them all together, and then perhaps we can go around and obviously hopefully answer them all between all of you. So first of all, this is specifically directed at Carlotta, I'm afraid. It says, with spectrum licensing, national regulatory authorities occasionally adapt rules to introduce additional operators. How should we ensure the right trade-off between maximizing short-term price competition versus ensuring a fair and sustainable market structure that would give investors long-term assurance to invest in the sector in Europe? And this has come from Stephen Pentland from Vodafone. So that's the first question. The second spectrum question is, can the panelists talk a little bit about how member states are coordinating specifically regarding border areas? And the third spectrum question, this one is directed specifically to Stefan. This is regarding fixed wireless access. Would 26 gigahertz millimeter wave spectrum not be the already existing solution and a demand indication for member states to assign as soon as possible? And that's from Andreas Geiss, who is, as probably most people know, the head of the spectrum unit in the European Commission. So maybe, shall we start with the first question? This was directed at you, Carlotta, but maybe we can start there and move on.
Sure, I'll go short. Thank you, Stefan, for the question. We've discussed this before, I think, but this is an important one. So maybe today, I mean, this was highly debated during the preparations of the European Electronic Communications Code. I mean, one of the objectives in new provisions that are put there is indeed how to ensure that spectrum assignment and the conditions, and how in particular the spectrum is reserved for new entrants, or how the spectrum caps are fixed, etc., that they take full account of the market situation, so competitive situation in the market. They ensure the most efficient use of a scarce resource, which is spectrum, and also how we make sure that it has the right impact on the investments and on the incentives to invest. And just to recall, it's not always NRAs who decide these things, depends on the member states. We also have other competent authorities, but at least we believe the code has brought in some provisions which should ensure that these 3 elements are looked into together in order to ensure a more balanced and an appropriate reflection of the conditions relative to the competition situation in the market. And also recall that there are many ways also to bring in flexibility, also thanks to very innovative spectrum sharing means, etc. So again, let's transpose the code and see if this is helping regulators and NRAs when they define these assignment conditions, and also the operators therein.
Great, thank you. Would anyone like to talk about the coordination between member states and border areas? Anyone address that?
Maybe I can kick off here, so to say. So of course, I mean, the practical coordination which happens is, for instance, in certain projects like the 5G cross-border corridors we have all heard about, and which are currently rolled out as a kind of a test beds for future developments. When it comes to the toolbox, there is the question of spectrum authorization for cross-border use cases, and this is something which we indeed among us discuss very controversial. So there's the question whether there are cross-border use cases or which could be seen as a best practice or not. There's also the question whether such a cross-border use cases should not come from the industry, which probably knows best what are such cases. And then it's the question whether there is certain spectrum be needed for certain use cases. And there, I think their member states have a rather mixed feeling about it. So many member states have some doubts that there needs specific spectrum dedicated for certain use cases. However, there might be also different views on this. What might be a way is to have technical conditions which are harmonized for certain use cases, which then are, of course, linked then to some extent to certain spectrum bands. But that's only the initial views and the ideas which are floated around. I wouldn't say that the outcome of this will be something very concrete. So here we are indeed in a very developing field. We look very much in the future. And of course, looking in the glass ball also comes with some uncertainties.
Great, thank you. Stefan, would you like to address Andreas's question?
Yes, so the millimeter wave, 26 gigahertz and other millimeter wave bands can play a role in delivering broadband connectivity in rural. In fact, 5G over millimeter wave was the first use case in the US, you remember, even before these standards were finalized. But things have gone awfully quiet because it proved not to be a good solution, primarily to the range. So it can be a solution, it can be a partial solution, it can be a solution in addition to bringing more upper midband spectrum simply because of the range. You will remember from the little picture I showed from the town in Rosenthal that the towers are typically not slap bang in the center of the town, but they're located maybe, let's say, 300 meters to the side of the town. And even after 300 meters, millimeter wave cell edge speeds does not work so well. Then you get rain fade on top and so on. It's a good technology, and undoubtedly it will help and contribute, but it will not deliver what additional upper midband spectrum could deliver.
Great, thank you. Okay, we don't have a lot of time left, but I've got a few questions, so let's try and go through those as quickly as we can. There's a couple which sort of relate to learning from best practices and the like, and our sort of recent experience in COVID, so I'll read those out. So actually, the first one is specifically addressed to Soren. Member states have done a good job identifying best practices that they can export to other countries. Importing best practices from other member states is more challenging, but potentially also more valuable. How can member states be incentivized to do this? And this is from Javier Dominguez from Telefonica. And then there's another question from Gustav Leniger, which is, there's been much talk about COVID-19, but is there any quantification or learnings from it to link into this discussion? So sort of best practice, learnings, COVID, how can we bring all this in and incentivize member states to implement? Maybe Soren, you could start with this and then... Yeah.
Yes, with pleasure. So I think maybe I should start with the criteria which we decided to use for establishing whether a proposal by the member states, and there were rather many proposals by member states, can be qualified as a best practice for the toolbox. In this regard, we looked first in whether a best practice or a certain practice is already present in the member states, then in its proportionality, but also in the transferability and universality of the measure, which would include the feasibility and suitability of implementation in other member states. So it is already, so to say, built in the process that what is put in the toolbox can be taken over by other member states. So that's the first point I would like to make towards the question of Javier. The other issue is, of course, that we have the implementation roadmaps and the reporting on the implementation. So it becomes more or less transparent whether member states take up a certain measure or not. And it is, of course, not only the self-commitment of the member states, which is strong, but it's also the expectations which we create towards the industry and the wider public with this toolbox, which, of course, will, in my opinion, work as a kind of a control and as a motivation for member states to look what they can take on board. But, of course, there's always the self-commitment and the objective of member states to improve themselves as well, of course, too. Just to go on with the second question on COVID-19, I mean, what comes there in my mind is actually that we had indeed some delays in the making available of spectrum to the operators. And this was partly also due to COVID-19. So I think there is a recommendation, or there is the idea in the toolbox to recommend to limit this as much as possible and to ensure that in spite of COVID-19, when the situation allows, such spectrum is also available. So there is some connection with the toolbox to address also some shortcomings which have come into place due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're pretty much out of time, but I'll put in one more question. It's quite a long question, so I think I'm going to summarize it. It's essentially saying, to what extent can we use mobile sites for providing fixed broadband connectivity? And obviously, you know, obviously it's done over 5G and the mobile operators doing it. That will obviously happen automatically. But what if it's another wireless provider, I suppose? And maybe I can throw this one over to Mathieu. I mean, maybe the answer is because operators, Vodafone, Orange, and others are divesting their sites. You know, maybe it will happen naturally because some of those sites, there's an incentive to get other users on there. But is there more that you as an operator can do as well to help with this process?
It is very difficult anyway to enter the mobile market nowadays. Effectively, with the divesting from towers that we see widely in the industry, there are opportunities for new entrants to install new services. Should they benefit from spectrum, and should they also benefit from a core network with dedicated fiber in order to link these towers? Not sure that we will see for the moment, I would say, new entrants. However,
yeah, I don't want to. Maybe I've misparaphrased the question, but I don't think it was specifically necessarily about a new mobile entrant. It might be a kind of, you know, someone just wanting to do fixed wireless access or fixed broadband.
Yeah, but I would say it's the same, because at the end it's an issue of having a critical size in order to have sufficient customers on an infrastructure. And so we saw that, for example, for WiMAX, where there were some initiative in order to deploy fixed wireless access in order to complement our DSL networks. This was a major issue faced by local authorities running WiMAX networks, which was having sufficiently customers in order to have a viable business case. So this will be the main challenge in order to have new entrants on this market.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we are very much out of time now, so I think we'd better draw a line here. I mean, can I thank all the panel members? I think we've had a fabulous discussion on the Connectivity Toolbox, and also a good introductory discussion to probably what will be tomorrow's topic of spectrum. So thank you all very much. I think you made great presentations, and thank you also to the audience. I managed to get all questions in except one during the session, so apologies there for not being able to get that last one in. But thank you for all your questions, and thank you for voting. The poll results were very interesting, and that's it now. So I'll just pass back to Dan to wrap up and tell you about tomorrow's agenda. Thank you very much, everyone.
Amit, thank you. And yeah, completely agree. That was a really, really interesting discussion, really interesting panel. And yeah, lots of issues covered there. And as you said, Amit, I think it does lead in very nicely to the discussions that we're going to be having tomorrow. So thank you very much again to all of our panelists. And Amit, thank you to you as well. As ever, excellently moderated. So thank you too. So that's it for today. But as Amit has mentioned there, we're back again tomorrow, and the focus is going to be more on a lot of the issues that we've been covering in that last session there on the issue of spectrum. So we're starting here again at 10 o'clock CET, where our first session is going to be looking specifically at the new radio spectrum policy program for the 5G era, looking at, I think the RSPG, I think it was last week, have released their report into the radio spectrum policy program. So we'll be talking about that and more broadly where to go with the new RSPP for the 5G era. Following on from that, we then move on to a session that's going to be focusing specifically on some of the pioneer bands for 5G, or the 3 pioneer bands for 5G, and looking at where we're at with rollout and with the award and allocation of those bands, so the 700, the 3.6, and the 26 gigahertz bands. And then finally, we're looking a bit further forward. So which bands are going to be the next generation of bands for connectivity for kind of 5G advanced and beyond, I suppose. So looking at kind of 5G and beyond, looking maybe even towards 6G, what are going to be the key bands there? So so lots of good discussions happening tomorrow. So please do come back and join us for those. As I said, we're back here again at 10 o'clock CET in the morning, and we've got those 3 sessions. Plus we've got another round of our showcase sessions, and we've actually got some live music happening tomorrow to wrap everything off. So we have our closing reception where we do have some live music and an opportunity for all of you to give your final thoughts and final takeaways from the event as well. So thank you very much to Amit and to all our panelists from that session. Thank you very much to all of our speakers from earlier today. Thanks to all of you for your participation. We'll be back here again tomorrow. And in the meantime, wishing everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you all. Bye.